I think women in this country have been conned, really, because the infant formula companies have created a situation which presents the choice between breast or bottle in much the same way as the choice between one nappy or another. And in reality, that's not the case. It's, even when it's done really well, and that's with really clean water and proper sterilisation and everything, it's always inferior to bottle feed. And in some instances, of course, even in this country, it can be lethal. Ramsey Singer has just been born.
Come on. No, not really.
I think a drop in the surface.
Yeah, let's see if you can get some colostrum out.
Ramsey is going to be breastfed because his parents know that it's the best way to feed him.
You go down, you have a taste.
Just put your finger under his chin and give him some encouragement.
Milk from the baby's own mother is tailor-made for the baby's requirements, and so a newborn babe receives milk that is substantially different from that which the mother gives to an older babe. The milk, in other words, changes during the lactation period. The very first milk, the colostrum that baby receives, has relatively little nutritional component, but is very rich in immunological factors which protect the baby against infection. Newborn babies of all sorts are susceptible to infections, particularly infections of the gut, and the colostrum provides antibodies and cells that protect the baby from these sorts of infections. The later milk contains much more in terms of nutrients, carbohydrates, fats and protein for the babe's growth.
Premature and underweight babies are particularly vulnerable to infection and benefit greatly from the immunological properties of breast milk. This London hospital uses breast milk in its special care baby unit as a matter of routine. Whenever possible, the mothers feed their own babies. Otherwise, donated breast milk from the milk bank is used.
Breast milk is nutritionally better than artificial feeds, which are mostly based on cow's milk, because the human milk protein is the right quality of protein for the baby as well as the right quantity of protein. And the quality of protein is particularly important for the growth of the baby in giving the amino acids that are necessary for growth. Also, the fat is quite different in breast milk to cow's milk or other feeds. It's better absorbed, and also the type of fatty acids much more closely meet the needs of the growing infant. It changes as the baby grows.
Come on, darling.
Ideally, babies should be breastfed for at least 4 to 6 months. But in Britain, 33% of mothers don't attempt to breastfeed at all. And of those that do, 1/3 have given up by 6 weeks.
Also, pay particular attention to the top here.
Though bottle feeding is generally considered to be safe here, you still have to take a great deal of care if infections are to be avoided.
That's where it collects, and it grows bugs. And when baby gets it, they get this condition called gastroenteritis, or the runs, and it could be fatal. So you wash it properly, making sure you use the brush around that side. Can you see? Checking in a good light to make sure all...
There are problems with bottle feeding, even in Britain, but they're not so evident because our health service deals with them effectively.
The baby to have soap.
I think it's very easy to become complacent about artificial feeding in this country because we see relatively few problems. Now, I think it is only when one goes to a poor third world country and you sit in a clinic and you see baby after baby coming in with diarrhea, malnourished, wasted, and all of these babies are being bottle fed. Then the situation becomes a little different. And I think that everyone needs to, if possible, at first hand, see something of this suffering and realize the scale of it. And then one becomes a great deal less accepting of infant milk companies' promotional activities, and you become less accepting of the whole idea of artificial feeding, I think.
The United Nations Children's Fund estimates that every year about 1 million infants die, largely in the third world countries, due to illnesses related or associated with bottle feeding. Now, this is a vast number of infants, and vast number of infants dying of unnecessary deaths. I think all this mortality is unnecessary. There's also a second thing, and that is if you have got a certain number of children dying, there is a proportion of children who will survive, but survive damaged. In other words, mortality figures are also indicators of morbidity or illnesses that may happen. So we are talking in terms of several million children being affected unnecessarily on account of bottle feeding. This is the sum total of the misery that is being created by the artificial feeding of infants in an environment where it is not necessary at all, because most mothers are traditionally and through their culture are geared to breastfeeding their infants. If at all they give up the tradition of breastfeeding their infants, it is mainly because of the promotional practices of the baby food manufacturers.
The baby milk companies have made sure that their product is sold as Western, modern and medically approved, and over the years have used many aggressive sales techniques. But their most effective method now is to manipulate the healthcare system to ensure that the babies receive a sample of their product.
A woman receives a sample like this to take home from a hospital. Her baby is 2 days old. She's going to believe this is what the doctor says is right for your baby. If you want your baby to grow up healthy and well, give it this. It's like a medicine. The baby milk industry delivers their products to the health professional, to the healthcare facility. The healthcare facility and the health professional is supposed to give this product to the mother, for the mother to use. Is supposed to use it in the healthcare facility to feed the infant who has just been born. Once that is done, the mother is in a way hooked to using that product, because once the product is used, then she cannot establish successful lactation. To me, that is manipulation of the healthcare facility by the baby milk industry. They use them as free salespeople.
Originally developed to get rid of the surplus products of the dairy industry, an artificial market has been created for baby milk, which is now worth £2 billion worldwide a year. Half of that total is from the third world, where economic and environmental conditions can be so different from ours.
If you want clean water, it is available to you at the turn of the tap. If you want power, it is available at the flick of a switch. Now, these are the sort of things that are not easily available in the third world, especially in the rural areas and maybe in the urban squatter slums. Now, assuming that in such circumstances, a mother has to decide to bottle feed her baby for one reason or another. So what happens is this. Somebody fetches water which is contaminated in the first place. It's got to be stored in the house, and whatever is the formula preparation that's got to be done will have to be done with this contaminated water. Remember that the mother is largely going to be uneducated, illiterate person, and therefore she's not going to be able to read the instructions on the tin. And now, this mother also has got very little background knowledge of hygiene and of infections that may arise due to lack of cleanliness of the bottle or polluted water. And the stage is set for a disaster. The conditions are so totally different, and to assume that similar conditions will be available in every home in the third world as they are available in every home in Western Europe or North America is absolutely crazy. And I think here comes the question of moral and social responsibility.
costs of artificial feeding are not often looked at. If you take a poor country like Mozambique, it's been estimated that if there were a mere 20% rise in bottle feeding, over 2 years, that would cost the country $10 million US. And that doesn't include the costs of distribution. It doesn't include the costs of the fuel for boiling the water. It doesn't include the health costs at all. And if you think of what that takes out of the country, they have to earn every cent of that hard currency. It's a huge cost in economic terms.
Many mothers buy baby milk because they believe it's the best thing for their babies. This can mean having to spend as much as half the family income. And this is crazy when they already have the perfect food in their own breasts. With formula costing so much, there's a great temptation to over-dilute it, so the baby receives a weak solution and is gradually starved. And on top of that, if either the bottle or the water are contaminated, a vicious cycle of illness is inevitable.
These illnesses may be either diarrheal diseases and recurrent diarrhea or malnutrition. Malnutrition may be related to either recurrent diarrhea or due to over-dilution of the feeds because the mothers cannot afford to feed the infant with the same concentration as the promoters of baby foods would suggest. Now, therefore, what we've got to say to ourselves that behind these glossy brochures depicting well-dressed, fashionable ladies bottle feeding a bonny baby in her lap, behind such a glossy picture, there lurks death.
The effects of bottle feeding, not just the deaths, but also the long-term damage to children, provoke worldwide concern. In America, consumer outrage led to a boycott of Nestlé, the largest baby milk manufacturer. As the public became more and more aware of the issue, the boycott spread to 10 countries, including Britain. Here it was coordinated by the Baby Milk Action Coalition. In 1978, a United States Senate investigation under Senator Edward Kennedy's chairmanship was called to look into the marketing practices of the baby milk industry. Nestlé was one of the key witnesses.
Would you agree with me that your product should not be used where there is impure water? Yes or no?
We give all the instructions.
Just answer. What is your position?
Of course not, but we cannot cope with that.
Well, as I understand what you say is where there's impure water, it should not be used.
Yes.
Where the people are so poor that they're not going to realistically be able to continue to purchase that, and which is going to mean that they're going to dilute it to a point, which is going to endanger the health, that it should not be used.
Yes.
All right, now, then my final question is what do you do, or what do you feel is your corporate responsibility to find out the extent of the use of your product in those circumstances in the developing part of the world? Do you feel that you have any responsibility?
We can't have that responsibility, sir. May I make a reference to...
You can't have that responsibility?
No.
In response to concern by member states at the decline in breastfeeding, the World Health Organization and UNICEF drafted a code of marketing aimed at restricting the unethical practices of the baby milk companies. This was adopted in 1981.
Any code in this area must be about providing the best care for babies. I mean, that's what it's all about. It's about providing care for babies. And the WHO code seems to do that very well. It does accept that there will be some children who will require substitutes, but it accepts the current medical opinion that the great majority of children will do far better if they can be fed on mother's breast milk, because that is milk that's formulated specially for the child. I mean, it works better. In the rare occasions when you need to move across, then a substitute needs to be available. It is inappropriate for that decision, which should be made on strictly medical grounds, to be biased by outside commercial interests. And a code should be designed, as the WHO code is, should be designed to protect the interests of the child and to stop it being commercially exploited.
This is something that I really think that mothers in Britain, they're just not being given that protection, and they deserve it. Our government voted for it, promised to do it, and has done nothing about it. In fact, they invited the industry to draft its own voluntary code.
The manufacturers' code in Great Britain was produced almost entirely by the manufacturers, with a little bit of consultation on the final draft at the end. The WHO code, because consumers have had a much greater impact upon it, is much more strict and much more restrictive, and positively tries to encourage breastfeeding. The UK manufacturers' code, on the other hand, more or less enshrines present marketing practices and allows the manufacturers to do more or less what they've been doing over the last 10 years. In fact, what they have been doing over the past 10 years.
I'd like to show you our new formula.
In
the tin, yes, and in the larger size as well.
This is 900 gram, which is exactly double the size of that.
Mm-hmm. And there's a slight difference to the formula than from the packets that we had before.
The companies choose, for a matter of policy, to ignore direct advertising to the consumer and promote their product almost entirely through the health clinics and the hospital wards.
Absorbent. Now that we have the technology to do it, we use a ferrous lactate.
We're now exporting, as you know, to 40 other countries, and it's felt that we should have...
In doing this, it gives them much more credibility in the eyes of the consumer, because it appears that the health service is endorsing the product. Because being available through the health service, it appears that the health service is actually approving it.
Yes. Can I have 2 boxes of Cow and Gate Premium? Yes. And vitamin drops.
What happens is that the companies have reps. The reps come into the clinic. They bring along with them all the advertising literature. They bring in the samples. Now, the literature that they bring in are books, educational leaflets for the mothers. Now, this one, for instance, is on breastfeeding, but on the back of it, it's actually advertising the tins of formula. This one is actually on bottle feeding, also advertising. In many ways, they're sort of filling a gap for health education, where there aren't any things to give out to the mothers. Then the companies will actually come in and produce the information for the client, knowing that we'll pass them on.
In the hospitals, the companies like their product to be in the maternity wards and available to any mother who uses infant formula. If they can have a monopoly, even better. We found in the Lancaster and Morecambe area that the monopoly of Cow and Gate in the hospital did affect their brand share very considerably indeed. They had about 60 to 70% of the market share in that region, whereas nationally they have about 30% of the share. So their policy of having a monopoly in the hospital and giving each mother, or getting the health authorities to give each mother as they leave the hospital, whether they're breastfeeding or bottle feeding, a sample of the product seems to work very effectively for them.
This represents probably a day's samples that might have been brought into the clinic. Now, this pack here was brought in the other day because it's a new tin. And also, this is a larger tin, which is just coming out on the market. So they've brought these in for the health visitors to suggest that the mothers might like to buy the double tin. But I know next time that they come in, they will leave a lot more small samples. Now, the small samples like these are left in large boxes. And I know jolly well that they expect us to pass those on to the mother.
The presence of these companies in the sort of everyday life of the medical profession and the health services has become almost an accepted fact. It's been going on for so long. They provide hospitality frequently for medical meetings, both at local and national level. They provide considerable funds for research. They actually provide salaries for research workers in some medical schools. and they are thoroughly integrated into the medical life of this of the health service. Now, this I think has had a profound effect on the attitude of doctors towards bottle feeding generally. Most pediatricians, I should say, of the older generation, at any rate, regard it as a rather benign activity. They don't regard it as a controversial matter. They're quite content that bottle feeding and breastfeeding should coexist. And on the whole, I think they don't necessarily go out of their way to promote breastfeeding.
Many hospitals now do a tremendous amount to encourage breastfeeding. This one employs a specialist infant feeding sister to counsel mothers and sort out problems if and when they occur. But far too many of our health professionals accept the inevitability of failure and resort to bottle feeding as the solution. They lack the knowledge, confidence and will needed to help women overcome difficulties. With the right help, failures are rare.
Now, this is how we show you to feed twins at the same time, because the other baby will be here. Please don't ask me how you feed triplets at the same time, because I don't know how you do it. Okay?
I have had very few women whom I've cared for who didn't start well and therefore continue well. In recent years, I've had a lot of women with problems referred to me, and sometimes the problem has become so severe and the woman's loss of confidence is so profound that whatever I do, I really can't put it together again. But it wasn't because it wasn't possible, it was because it was too late. There are very, very few reasons for women not being able to breastfeed.
This baby's mother went into hospital wanting to breastfeed.
I had a lot of difficulty, mainly because the nipple on one breast was flat and the baby had difficulty fixing on. First of all, doctors didn't show any interest whatsoever in breastfeeding, so it was down to the nursing staff. And I found that either they were sympathetic but didn't have much experience, like the student nurses, or else the more experienced nurses were very busy. They didn't really have the time that I felt was needed to sit down and give you support. On the third day, the sister came round the wards and she said to me, basically, you can't do it. You've got the wrong shaped breasts. You won't be able to breastfeed your baby. It's a problem of nature, she said. It's not your fault. And I was completely undermined by that. What's more, she said I was starving the baby and that I should start giving her bottle milk straight away and that I could continue if I wanted feeding on one side, but she didn't think I'd be able to do it in the long term. So she reduced me to a puddle of tears on the floor. So late, I started giving Neve some bottle milk, and then later on that evening I decided to ring a breastfeeding counsellor I knew of. And this woman, just on the phone, she just said to me, you can do it, basically. Don't worry. You know, you can do it. And that was the most important thing that she said. So then after I left hospital, she came round to see me and just gave me some support and advice. And I was able to breastfeed Neve, and still am.
We've got cases upon cases of failures to breastfeed. They haven't actually been helped over the hurdle, so those women haven't got the choice. The women that whenever I've talked to women who've bottle fed from the start and have wanted to bottle feed, they don't feel guilty. They just come straight out and said, I don't want to be like a cow or whatever. They just say, I bottle fed. And that's it. They know what they were doing. But the ones who wanted to breastfeed and failed feel really bitter and angry. And I think they've got every right to be angry because they've had something that's really important to them taken away. And that oughtn't to happen. Some health professionals are not sure how to position the baby at the breast, and babies often end up chewing on the nipple as if it were a teat. This can be very painful, as this mother found out before she received the correct advice.
And now let's have her breastfeeding and not bottle feeding. That's a girl. Get her on there beautifully. Come on, sweetheart. Let me have your hand. There's a good girl. You just show us what a clever girl you... Oh, beautiful. Oh, darling, that's lovely. Now she's got much more of the breast in from underneath. and a lot of the areola showing above. How does that feel?
Much better. You can't feel it at all.
No. So now she's breastfeeding beautifully.
In bottle-feeding Britain, there's a great deal of ignorance about breastfeeding. But what's surprising is how quickly this knowledge has been lost in cultures that traditionally breastfed. One factor has been the inaccurate informational literature that the milk companies have supplied, and which governments are reluctant to spend money on to replace.
If you read the book that comes from the baby milk industry, which most of it is from the baby milk industry, they tell you breastfeeding is good, but feed every 4 hours, wash your nipple before and after every feed, and once you do those things, you won't last 2 weeks breastfeeding. You're just going to fail and you're going to bottle feed. So that's what comes across, and in the end, you just end up bottle feeding. And it may not be just the rural women, it is the elite, my friends who are around me, end up bottle feeding because of that message. And eventually the message gets across over time that women never have enough milk, they must always top up their feeds. Breast milk alone is not a food for a baby, you must top it up with milk. That's it, so we end up bottle feeding.
For many years, overseas medical workers have trained in the industrialised bottle-feeding countries, and misguided practices can now be found all over the Third World. In this Peruvian hospital, for example, it's standard practice to separate mothers and babies and give routine bottle feeds. Practices such as these are inextricably linked with milk company actions. The World Health Organization's code was an effort to break this stranglehold and free the health services from the commercial pressures.
I think that we do have responsibilities in this country that extend more widely than simply the geographical boundaries of the United Kingdom. And certainly, if there's new information or if it seems necessary to review what's going on, I'm sure that the BMA would look again to see whether the FMF code is providing any adequate safeguards, not only for this country, but in terms of the attitude that it engenders in other people who come across here.
The milk companies are still giving out samples. They deliver their products at healthcare facilities, and every mother in some countries routinely gets a tin to go back home with. They should not be doing that. Literature, which idealizes bottle feeding and does not say anything about the benefits of breastfeeding, is still going out to mothers, is still being distributed in healthcare facilities. We still find literature hung up on healthcare facilities distributed by the medical representatives of the baby milk industry. They should not be doing that. The labels, even of Nestle, who in January this year agreed to abide by the international code, still has got white chubby babies and does not address itself to the languages of the people in those countries, and is still going out. And this information we find out as late as April 1984. They should not be doing that, and they are continuing.
Believe me, violations of the international code are not trivial. Their consequences all too often are tragic. In many third world countries, when a child dies, it's common practice to put a precious possession on its grave. Ironically, this is often a can of baby milk or a feeding bottle.